The billionaire visits his maid's humble house, and what he discovers makes him cry. Rylan Hargrove stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass of his penthouse office, the weight of billions resting in his silence. The city below was a mere grid of light and movement, existing only because his logistics empire allowed it to function. He did not look at the view. Instead, he studied his own reflection, checking the knot of his silk tie and adjusting a sapphire cufflink. He had never lost a negotiation because he never acknowledged the possibility of losing. Behind him, a smooth-running machine operated in total quiet. Administrative assistants moved with calculated precision, placing documents on his desk and retrieving them without making eye contact. One set down a crystal glass of freshly squeezed orange juice on a coaster that cost more than a minimum wage weekly salary. Rylan turned, picked up the glass, and walked to his desk. He sat in the hand-stitched leather chair, molded perfectly to his posture. On the corner of his desk, amidst the sleek obsidian and steel, sat an anomaly, a small, roughly hand-carved oak sparrow. It was crude, unfinished, and deeply personal. Rylan did not remember where it came from, only that it had been there, perhaps left by some sentimental cleaning staff he had never bothered to meet. He picked it up, feeling the coarse grain against his smooth palm. He hated it. It was imperfect. He dropped it into the wastebasket. "Landon," Rylan said, not raising his voice. Landon Thorpe, his chief legal counsel and professional fixer, appeared instantly from the adjoining room. He was a man who lived in the shadow of Rylan's ambition. "The Oak Haven County acquisition," Rylan said, taking a sip of the juice. "Why is the deed not in my inbox?" Landon cleared his throat, a sound that in this office was equivalent to a scream. "We have a holdout. One parcel right in the center of the grid for the new automated hub. The owner refuses to sign." Rylan set the glass down. "Refuses?" He repeated the word as if it were a foreign language. "Increase the offer." "We did." "Then increase it further. They won't even respond to the calls now." "Then go there. Take the hard copy. Take a notary. Take the check." Rylan looked back out the window. "I don't want to hear the word refuses again." He picked up a pen and signed a merger agreement that would dissolve 3 competing companies. He did not look at the final number. Lila Monroe polished the silver fixture of the master bath in the Hargrove penthouse. She worked in rhythm with the silence. Her light blue Maid uniform was crisp, the white apron immaculate. Her hands, rougher than they should be, moved with a precision that rivaled Rylan Hargrove's automation. She did not exist when he was present. She was shadow and service. When he entered a room, she became part of the furniture. When he left, she erased his presence, leaving only perfection. She finished the fixture and bent down to empty the wastebasket near the desk. Her hand stopped. She saw the oak sparrow resting on top of a discarded memo. Her fingers brushed against the raw wood. She looked up, checking the mirror to ensure she was alone. Lila picked up the sparrow. It was heavy and comforting. She rubbed the small indentation where the wing was meant to be. This was the mate. She knew the carver's style. She pulled the first oak sparrow, the one she had carefully salvaged from a dusting bin, from her apron pocket. She pressed the 2 carved birds together in her palm. Perfect mates. She placed the second sparrow back in her pocket, the weight pressing against her thigh as she continued to work. She emptied the wastebasket, erasing the evidence that Rylan Hargrove had ever discarded something so small. She moved from the desk, dusting the sculpture nearby, her quiet, steady face reflected in it. When her shift ended, she changed into her street clothes, her fingers brushing the oak birds one last time before leaving the sterile environment of the glass tower. She walked to the subway, descending into the noise and heat, another invisible face among thousands. Landon Thorpe stood on the edge of a gravel road, looking at the coordinates on his tablet. Hargrove Logistics did not make mistakes, yet this felt like a massive rural error. According to the satellite data, the automated hub's primary access point was located right where a rustic clay and stone countryside house stood. The house was poor. The mud walls were cracked, revealing the raw earth beneath. The traditional tiled roof was patched with modern tin. It was a scar on the land Rylan intended to perfect. Landon straightened his jacket and walked toward the door. An elderly black man, Silas Monroe, sat on a simple white wooden chair under the shade of a skeletal tree, whittling a piece of wood. He did not look up as the lawyer approached. "Mr. Monroe?" Landon asked. Silas stopped whittling, his knife hovering. "Depending on who's asking. I represent Hargrove Logistics. We sent you several offers regarding this property." Silas looked at the wood. "I got them. We are prepared to double the last offer. It is more money than you could make in many lifetimes, sir. All you have to do is sign." Landon held out the digital tablet. Silas resumed whittling. A curl of oak fell to the dusty ground. "My granddaughter lives here. Her mother lived here. Her mother before that. This is not a negotiation, son. It's my life." "Mr. Hargrove wants this property," Landon said, his tone sharpening. Silas looked up, his eyes milky but steady. "And I want to finish whittling this sparrow." The white luxury sedan pulled smoothly into the Hargrove corporate parking garage, reserved exclusively for Rylan. He did not drive himself often, but today required a direct approach. The failure of Landon Thorpe was not acceptable. Landon was waiting by the elevator, his face pale. "He refused again?" Rylan asked before the elevator doors even opened. "He wouldn't even look at the tablet. It's an old man, Rylan. A holdout. We can just initiate the eminent domain process and—" "No, I want that hub running." Rylan grabbed the hard copy file from Landon's hand. "Where are the coordinates?" "It's out in the county. Reschedule the afternoon briefings. I'm going myself." "You!" Landon's voice cracked. "Rylan, this is below you. Let me handle it. I'll bring the sheriff. You've spent time handling it. I'll handle it quickly." Rylan walked past him to the driver's side of the luxury sedan. He had already dismissed Landon from his mind. Lila unlocked the front door of the rustic house. The dusty smell of home, old wood, dried herbs, and earth enveloped her. A sharp contrast to the antiseptic ozone of the penthouse. "Grandpa," she called out. Silas was sitting in the same chair under the tree, but he was holding the finished carving. He looked tired. "The lawyer came back," Silas said. Lila dropped her bag and knelt beside him. "The same one." "No, a nervous one. Offered more money. He said the big man himself might come." Silas ran his thumb over the new carving. It was a hawk, sharp and aggressive. "We don't need his money, Grandpa. He doesn't know that. Men like that, they think everything is for sale." Lila looked at the clay walls of their home. It was old, but it was theirs. It was the only place she was truly visible. "Let him come," she said softly. The white luxury sedan was entirely out of place on the dirt road leading into Oakhaven. Dust coated the immaculate paint. The suspension, tuned for city asphalt, groaned against the ruts. Rylan's hands gripped the leather steering wheel tighter than necessary. He felt the coarse grain, which reminded him unpleasantly of the crude carving he had thrown away. The GPS coordinates announced he had arrived. He stopped the car. He looked at the house. It was worse than the photos, a clay hovel with a tin roof, a monument to failure. Rylan checked his tie in the rearview mirror. He took the legal file from the passenger seat. He stepped out of the air-conditioned cabin into the dry, overpowering heat of the countryside. He walked toward the elderly man sitting under the tree. Silas Monroe stopped whittling. He looked at Rylan Hargrove. "You're the big man," Silas stated. Not a question. I am the owner of Hargrove Logistics, Ryland said, his voice smooth and commanding. He did not offer a handshake. And I am here to personally deliver an offer that will change your life, Mr. Monroe. The front door of the rustic house creaked open. We don't want your offer, a woman's voice said from the shadows. Lila Monroe stepped into the bright sunlight, still wearing the crisp white blouse of her street clothes, but her posture was no longer invisible. She stood beside her grandfather, her hands pressed together. Ryland Hargrove froze. The direct, aggressive speech he had prepared died in his throat. He stared at the woman he had never truly looked at, the one who polished his fixtures and erased his existence. Lila, he said, the name unfamiliar on his tongue. The midday sun struck the Oak Haven dirt with a brilliant, unforgiving light, casting sharp, natural shadows across the yard. The heat radiated from the cracked, dry earth, bleaching the sparse, rural vegetation that clung to the hills in the background. In the center of this desolation sat the modern luxury white sedan, its pristine aerodynamic curves and gleaming paint creating a violent, jarring contrast against the rough textures of the countryside. Dust had already begun to settle on its hood, dulling the engineered perfection of the machine. Ryland Hargrove did not move. His hands remained at his sides. He stared at the woman standing before the rustic clay and stone house. The mud walls behind her were heavily cracked, revealing the wooden beams that struggled to hold up the old traditional tiled roof. It was a structure built on survival, entirely devoid of the capital flow that dictated Ryland's reality. He recognized her instantly. It was the silence that gave her away. It was the exact same immovable, absolute silence she carried into his penthouse every morning. Silas Monroe slowly pushed himself up from his chair. He did not look at the billionaire. He gathered his whittling knife and a fresh block of wood. "Sun's getting heavy," the old man murmured, his voice dry as the hills. He turned and walked into the shadowed interior of the modest house, the screen door slapping shut behind him with a hollow crack that echoed across the empty yard. Ryland was left standing in the dust. He looked down at his polished black leather dress shoes. A fine layer of yellow dirt was already clinging to the immaculate leather. He looked back up. Lila was gone. She had followed her grandfather inside. He walked forward, his stride measured and deliberate, refusing to let the uneven, dusty rural ground alter his posture. He approached the simple white wooden chair Silas had vacated. Ryland sat down. He was a handsome black man in his early 30s, his dark skin flawless, his short hair and well-groomed beard edged with razor precision. He wore an elegant navy blue tailored suit, a pristine white dress shirt, and a colorful patterned tie tucked perfectly beneath a silk pocket square. He crossed his legs. He rested his hands together in his lap, interlocking his fingers. He leaned back slightly, his posture projecting the confident, relaxed aura of a man who owned the earth beneath him, even if the deed did not yet reflect it. He waited. He was accustomed to waiting only when it served to intimidate the other party. The screen door opened. Lila stepped out into the bright daytime light. She had changed. She no longer wore her street clothes. She was dressed in her classic light blue maid dress, the fabric crisp and perfectly pressed, the white collar buttoned to the throat, a spotless white apron tied securely around her waist. Her dark brown hair was pulled back and tied in a neat, flawless bun. The uniform was a deliberate boundary. It was the architecture of their relationship, constructed right here in the dust. In her hands, she held a small, tarnished silver tray. Resting on the center of the tray was a heavy crystal glass filled with fresh, bright orange juice. Ice clinked softly against the rim. She walked toward him, her steps silent on the packed earth. She stopped in the foreground, just to his left. She stood respectfully, holding the tray out toward him. Her dark skin caught the warm daylight. Her expression was entirely gentle, entirely humble. She looked slightly downward, refusing to meet his eyes directly, a soft, respectful smile resting on her lips. "Your juice, Mr. Hargrove," she said. Her tone was exact. It was the precise frequency she used in the penthouse. Ryland stared at the glass. He looked at the cracked mud walls of her home, then at the luxury vehicle parked beside it, and finally back to the maid serving him in the middle of nowhere. The dissonance was absolute. He unclasped his hands and took the glass. The crystal was heavy and cold. "You clean my floors," Ryland said, his voice flat, devoid of a question. "Yes, sir," Lila replied softly. "You make minimum wage." "A bit more, sir, after the annual adjustment." She kept her eyes directed at the dust near his polished shoes. Ryland took a slow sip of the juice. It was perfect. "I am going to build a fully automated shipping hub on this exact location, Lila. It will process millions of packages a day. It requires direct access to the interstate. Your grandfather's property sits precisely on the central loading artery." He set the glass down on the edge of the tray she still held. "I am offering a substantial sum for this clay house." Lila did not flinch. Her hands, holding the tray, did not waver by a single millimeter. Deep inside the right pocket of her crisp white apron, the heavy hand-carved oak sparrow pressed against her thigh. She focused on the weight of the wood through the fabric. "The property is not for sale, Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice maintaining its gentle service industry cadence. Ryland let out a short, quiet breath. He looked out at the dry hills. "You understand that this sum removes you from this dust. It removes you from my penthouse. You would never have to wear that apron again." "Will there be anything else, sir?" she asked, her soft, respectful smile never breaking. Ryland looked at her face. He searched for the calculation, the greed, the hesitation. There was nothing. Just the quiet, immovable surface of a woman doing her job. "I don't leave things unfinished," Ryland said, uncrossing his legs and standing up. He buttoned his suit jacket. "Tell your grandfather the offer expires soon." He turned and walked to the white sedan. He got in, the heavy door sealing him inside a soundproof, climate-controlled vault. He started the engine. Lila stood in the yard, holding the silver tray, watching as the vehicle turned around and drove away, a massive cloud of dust rising behind it, slowly settling over the dry earth and the cracked roof of her home. She reached into her apron pocket and ran her thumb over the rough, unfinished wing of the oak sparrow. The fluorescent lights of the Hargrove Logistics legal department hummed at a frequency specifically designed to keep employees alert. Landon Thorpe sat at the head of a long, polished mahogany table, surrounded by stacks of municipal zoning codes and property tax histories. Ryland stood by the window, looking out at the city grid. "Oak Haven County is desperate for infrastructure revenue," Landon said, sliding a thick folder across the table. "They have a municipal ordinance regarding agricultural water usage. It was never enforced. If we push the county commissioner, they can reclassify the Monroe parcel as non-compliant. The fines would compound daily." "Do it," Ryland said to the glass. "It will cut off their the reservoir access. They won't have running water." "I said do it." Ryland turned around. "I want the access road reclassified as a commercial construction zone. I want the county to pull their maintenance, buy the debt of the local supply stores. If they want to live in the dirt, let them feel exactly what the dirt costs." The tap in the modest clay and stone house sputtered, coughed a spray of brown rust, and went completely dry. Silas stood at the sink, his hands resting on the warm porcelain. He looked out the window at the distant county trucks, erecting orange barricades across the main dirt road. Lila walked into the kitchen. She wore a faded gray t-shirt and heavy denim jeans. She saw the dry tap. She did not sigh. She did not speak. She simply turned, walked to the back corner of the room, and picked up 2 heavy galvanized steel buckets. She walked out the back door. The sun was merciless. The county trucks had blocked the road, meaning the drive to the secondary well was impossible. Lila began to walk. The dry brush scraped against her jeans. The heat pressed down on her shoulders. She walked the distance to the creek line, filled the heavy steel buckets, and began the walk back. Her arms burned. The metal handles bit into the calluses on her palms. She focused her eyes on a fixed point on the horizon. She regulated her breathing. In, out, step, step. She reached the house, her shirt soaked in sweat, and carefully poured the water into the boiling pot on the stove. She did not spill a drop. Ryland sat at a corner table in an exclusive, low-lit restaurant. The ambient noise was a soft murmur of wealth and influence. A waiter in a crisp tuxedo placed a perfectly seared, dry-aged steak in front of him, resting on a stark white porcelain plate. The silver cutlery gleamed under the directional lighting. Ryland placed his hands on the table, resting them on the heavy white linen tablecloth. His hands were perfectly manicured, relaxed, entirely free of tension. He looked at the steak. He picked up his knife. He made a single, precise cut. He did not eat it. He set the knife down. He stared at the empty chair across from him. Lila sat on the edge of her narrow cot. The room was dark, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the cracks in the wooden shutters. Her hands rested in her lap. They were shaking. The tremors started in her wrists and vibrated down to her fingertips, a violent physical reaction to hauling heavy water under the sun. She reached into the pocket of her jeans. She pulled out the hand-carved oak sparrow. She gripped it tightly in her right hand, pressing the sharp, unpolished edges into her palm. The pain of the wood grounded her. She closed her eyes. She held the wooden bird until the shaking in her hands slowly subsided into a dull, steady ache. The elevator doors of the penthouse opened with a soft chime. Ryland stepped out, his phone pressed to his ear. "I don't care if the commissioner is hesitant, Landon. Double his campaign contribution. I want the Monroe property condemned." Ryland walked into his penthouse office. He stopped. Lila Monroe was standing by the floor-to-ceiling glass window. She was wearing her classic light blue Maid dress, the white collar crisp, the apron immaculate. She held a microfiber cloth in her hand. She was wiping a microscopic smudge from the glass. She had walked past the county barricades in the dark to reach the highway bus stop. She had ridden into the city. She had arrived exactly on time for her shift. Ryland lowered the phone from his ear. He hung up without saying goodbye. Lila finished polishing the glass. She turned around. Her dark eyes met his for a fraction of a second before dropping respectfully to the floor. Her expression was serene. She showed absolutely no signs of the physical devastation of the previous days. "Good morning, Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice perfectly modulated, empty of any exhaustion or anger. Ryland stared at her. The vast billion-dollar machinery he had unleashed against her had not altered her routine by a single minute. He looked at her hands, resting quietly against her white apron. He did not see the blisters. He saw only a terrifying, impenetrable resilience. She picked up her cleaning caddy. "I will begin the boardroom, sir, unless you need the office first." Ryland did not answer. He watched her walk silently past him, a ghost in his machine, entirely immune to the gravity of his wealth. Ryland Hargrove stood at the head of the glass-walled conference room on the penthouse floor. Spread across the massive granite table were topographical maps of Oak Haven County, stamped with the red seals of municipal authorities. Landon Thorpe sat to his left, sliding a heavy final document across the polished stone. It was a formal order of condemnation. Ryland picked up a solid tungsten pen. He did not read the paragraphs of legal precedent. He pressed the metal tip to the paper and signed his name with hard, sharp strokes. The ink bled slightly into the thick paper. He handed the document back to Landon. "The sheriff executes the eviction," Ryland said. "Bring the bulldozers directly behind the cruisers. Once the roof is down, the property classification shifts permanently to industrial salvage. They won't have the capital to file an injunction before the concrete is poured." Lila Monroe stood in the industrial laundry room hidden behind the kitchen of the Hargrove penthouse. The air was thick with heat and the chemical smell of bleach. She held a heavy iron, pressing it down onto the collar of a spare white apron. Steam hissed violently as the hot metal met the damp cotton. She moved the iron with absolute precision. Forward, back. The fabric smoothed out, perfectly flat, erasing all evidence of wear. She folded the apron, placed it on a pristine stack, and picked up the next wrinkled garment. Ryland sat in the back of a black executive SUV. He had abandoned the white luxury sedan. Its suspension was severely damaged from his previous trip to Oakhaven. The SUV was built like a vault, absorbing the shock of the unpaved rural roads without transferring a single vibration to the leather seats inside. He held a manila envelope containing the copies of the condemnation order. He stared at the tinted window. The dry hills rolled past, bleached and dead under the afternoon sun. He checked his phone. The market was closing. His net worth had increased significantly since breakfast. He locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the seat. The SUV turned onto the dirt road leading to the Monroe property. The orange barricades erected by the county had been shoved aside by the vehicle's heavy steel grille. Ryland told the driver to wait at the edge of the property line. He stepped out into the crushing heat. The yard was empty. The simple white wooden chair sat vacant beneath the skeletal tree. The house looked even more fragile than before. The cracked mud walls seemed to lean slightly. The traditional tiled roof sagging under the weight of gravity and neglect. Ryland did not pause in the yard. He walked directly to the front porch. His heavy dress shoes crushed the dry grass. He did not knock. He wrapped his hand around the rusted iron handle of the screen door and pulled it open. The hinges screamed. He pushed the heavy inner wooden door open with his shoulder and stepped across the threshold. The interior of the house was a sudden, jarring shift in temperature and light. It was dark, the air cooled by the thick earthen walls, smelling of dried sage, old wood ash, and dust. The floorboards creaked under his weight. Silas Monroe sat at a small, scarred wooden kitchen table. He was repairing a heavy canvas strap with a thick needle and twine. He did not stop his work when the door hit the wall. He did not look up. Ryland walked to the table. He dropped the heavy manila envelope onto the wood. The slap of the paper echoed in the quiet room. "The county has condemned the structure," Ryland said. His voice filled the small space, loud and absolute. "The sheriff will be here to remove you. The demolition begins shortly after you are off the property. You have time to pack whatever you think is worth saving." Silas pulled the thick twine through the canvas. It made a rough scraping sound. "You're standing on my floor, Mr. Hargrove." Ryland paced away from the table. He looked at the kitchen. A cast-iron pot sat on a cold stove. The sink was dry. The shelves held chipped ceramic plates and jars of preserved vegetables. "You brought this on yourself," Ryland said, gesturing to the room. "I offered you an exit. I offered you wealth. You chose to sit in the dirt. Now I am taking the dirt." He walked toward the narrow hallway leading to the back of the house. He wanted to see the entirety of the ruin he was erasing. He wanted to map the poverty. "Don't go back there," Silas said. The needle stopped. Ryland ignored him. He pushed past a faded curtain hanging in the hallway and stopped in front of a closed wooden door. The wood was deeply scored, older than the rest of the house. He turned the brass knob and pushed the door open. The back room was entirely different from the rest of the house. It was spotless. The dust that coated the front rooms was absent here. The wooden floorboards were polished to a dull shine. The afternoon sun filtered through a small, clean window, casting a warm, rectangular beam of light across the center of the space. In the corner sat a heavy medical bed, its metal rails lowered. Beside it stood an empty green medical oxygen cylinder. The blankets on the bed were folded with severe military precision. Ryland stepped into the room. The air was perfectly still. Against the far wall, under the window, was a long, heavy wooden workbench. It was covered in tools, small chisels, fences, sandpaper, and a worn leather strop. Wood shavings were swept neatly into a pile at the corner of the desk. Lined up along the back edge of the workbench were dozens of hand-carved oak animals. There were hawks, foxes, and wolves, and there were sparrows. Dozens of sparrows. Ryland stopped breathing. He walked slowly toward the workbench. He reached out and picked up one of the sparrows. He turned it over in his hand. He looked at the deep, asymmetrical gouge under the left wing. It was a flaw in the carving technique. It was the exact same flaw, the exact same knife stroke as the oak sparrow he had picked up from his glass desk in the penthouse and thrown into the wastebasket. Ryland looked up from the wooden bird. Pinned to the wall above the workbench was a single faded photograph. It showed 3 people in the front yard of the house. Silas Monroe stood on the left, looking younger, his hand resting on the shoulder of a man sitting in the simple white wooden chair. Lila Monroe, wearing a high school graduation gown, stood on the right. The man in the chair was frail, his clothes hanging loosely on his frame. He was holding a piece of raw wood and a carving knife. He was looking directly at the camera. He was smiling. It was a wide, genuine, unburdened smile. Ryland stared at the face of Thomas Hargrove. He stared at his father, the father who had disappeared into a haze of debt and failure. The father Ryland had legally severed himself from, cutting off all communication and financial support to protect the rising stock price of Hargrove Logistics. The father who had simply vanished from the corporate record. Ryland's hand began to shake. The tremor started in his fingers and traveled up his arm. The hand-carved oak sparrow slipped from his grip and hit the wooden workbench with a dull, heavy clatter. He looked down. Next to the pile of wood shavings lay a folded piece of heavy paper. It was a county death certificate. Ryland did not need to pick it up to read the bold black ink at the top. Name of deceased, Thomas Hargrove. Place of death, Oak Haven County. Primary caretaker, informant, Silas Monroe. Ryland stepped back. His polished black leather dress shoe hit the metal base of the oxygen cylinder. It rang out a hollow metallic sound in the quiet room. He looked at the bed. He looked at the oxygen tank. He looked at the tools. His billion-dollar empire had spent time trying to crush this property. He had starved the water line. He had bought the debt. He had signed the condemnation. He had just ordered bulldozers to destroy the only place in the world where his father had found peace. A shadow moved in the doorway. Lila Monroe stood there. She was wearing her faded gray t-shirt and heavy denim jeans. She held a galvanized steel bucket in her left hand. Her hands were raw, covered in fresh red blisters from the miles she had walked to carry water. She looked at Ryland. She looked at the photograph on the wall. She looked at the oak sparrow resting on the workbench. Ryland turned to her. His pristine tailored suit suddenly felt like a cage. The rigid structure of his posture collapsed. His shoulders dropped. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, to issue an order, to leverage his authority. No sound came out. He sat in the chair every morning, Lila said. Her voice was quiet, completely void of malice. It was the factual statement of a historian. He liked the sun on his face. He said it was the first time he had ever been warm. Rylan looked at her raw, blistered hands. He thought of the heavy steel bucket. He thought of the water line he had ordered shut off. He thought of the sparrow on his desk, the one she must have placed there, the piece of his father she had quietly carried into his glass tower, only to watch him throw it away. "Why didn't you tell me?" Rylan whispered. The acoustics of the room stripped the power from his voice. It sounded small. Lila set the steel bucket down on the floorboards. She reached into the pocket of her jeans and pulled out the mate to the sparrow. She placed it gently on the edge of the medical bed. "You didn't ask, Mr. Hargrove," she said. The heavy door of the black executive SUV slammed shut, sealing Rylan Hargrove inside the soundproof cabin. He did not sit back against the leather. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor mats. The engine started, a deep, silent vibration. "Drive," Rylan said. He pulled his phone from his pocket. He bypassed his assistants and dialed Landon Thorpe's direct line. "Landon," Rylan said, his voice stripped of its usual smooth cadence. "The condemnation order." "Stop it!" There was a pause on the line. The ambient sound of the legal department hummed in the background. "Rylan, I filed the paperwork. The judge signed it. The county commissioner authorized the overtime for the sheriff's department. The heavy machinery is already staged at the county line. I don't care where it is staged. Withdraw the order." "I can't just withdraw a public health hazard decree on a whim, Rylan. You forced the county to classify the structure as an immediate danger to the automated hub infrastructure. Reversing a judicial signature takes time. The eviction is set." "By the judge," Rylan said, staring at the tinted window. "We did by the judge," Landon replied, his voice tightening, "to push the order through. If we tried to bribe him to reverse his own expedited ruling shortly after, it triggers a federal audit. You built a machine designed to crush this property without friction, Rylan. The machine is running. I cannot stop it before sunrise." Rylan ended the call. He dropped the phone onto the leather seat. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. The man who dictated the flow of global commerce could not stop a single yellow bulldozer in a rural county. Lila Monroe stood in the quiet of the back room. The beam of afternoon light had shifted, illuminating the wooden workbench and the rows of carved oak animals. She bent down and picked up the heavy manila envelope containing the condemnation order Rylan had thrown on the kitchen table. She did not open it. She walked to the cast-iron stove in the kitchen. She opened the heavy metal door. Inside, a small fire burned, boiling the last of the hold water. Lila pushed the manila envelope into the flames. The thick paper blackened, curled, and dissolved into ash. She returned to the back room. She walked to the workbench. She picked up the hand-carved oak sparrow Rylan had dropped. She rubbed her thumb over the deep, asymmetrical gouge beneath the left wing. She placed the sparrow back in its exact position, in the line of wooden birds. The penthouse was dark. Rylan stood behind his desk. The city grid glowed below him. The administrative assistants were gone. The silence of the office, usually a symbol of his absolute control, now felt like a vacuum. He opened the bottom drawer of his obsidian desk. He pulled out a thick, legal-bound portfolio. It was a blank, irrevocable trust document designed for corporate acquisitions. He laid it flat on the desk. He picked up his tungsten pen. He began to write. He transferred ownership of the Oak Haven coordinates. He added the surrounding acres. He wrote down a significant sum, tying it to a blind trust in Silas Monroe's name. He funded it directly from his personal accounts, bypassing the corporate structure entirely. He pressed the pen so hard into the paper that the metal tip tore through the heavy parchment on his signature. He closed the portfolio. He did not sleep. The morning sun broke over the dry Oak Haven hills, casting long, pale shadows across the dirt. Lila Monroe stood in the yard, holding a wooden basket. She was hanging washed clothes on a thick cord strung between the porch pillar and the skeletal tree. The black executive SUV appeared on the horizon. It did not move with its usual smooth glide. It sped down the rutted dirt road, kicking up a massive wake of yellow dust. It skidded to a halt at the edge of the property line. Rylan Hargrove stepped out. He was still wearing the navy blue tailored suit from the day before. The pristine white dress shirt was wrinkled. The colorful patterned tie was missing. He walked across the dry grass, carrying the heavy legal portfolio. Lila reached into the basket, pulled out a faded cotton towel, and pinned it to the line. She did not look at him. Ryland stopped a short distance away from her. The physical boundary between them remained absolute. "I brought the deed," Ryland said. His voice was raw. He held out the portfolio. "The land is yours in perpetuity. I added the surrounding acres. There is a trust fund attached. It contains enough capital to rebuild this house, to pipe in a private reservoir, to do whatever you want." Lila picked up another towel. She shook the wrinkles from the fabric. She pinned it to the line, the wood of the clothespin snapping sharply in the quiet morning air. "He was my father," Ryland said, the words heavy and clumsy in his mouth. "He left when I was young. The debts were destroying my first company. I severed him from my life to protect the asset. I didn't know he came here. I didn't know he was sick." Lila lowered her arms. She turned to face him. She looked at the expensive leather portfolio in his hands. "He did not talk about you, Mr. Hargrove," Lila said. Her voice carried no malice, no pity, no judgment. It was entirely factual. "He talked about the grain of the oak. He talked about the heat of the sun. He did not need your capital. He needed a chair." Ryland stared at her. "I am trying to fix this." "There is nothing here for you to fix," Lila said. She turned her back to him, reached into the basket, and continued hanging the damp cloth. Ryland stood in the dirt, holding a portfolio worth a fortune, completely incapable of making her take it. The sky over Oak Haven County was a bruised, dark purple, slowly bleeding into a pale, cold gray. The air was entirely still. At the intersection of the paved state highway and the dirt road leading to the Monroe property, a convoy of heavy machinery idled. 2 yellow bulldozers, their massive steel blades resting an inch above the asphalt. 3 Oak Haven County sheriff's cruisers, their light bars flashing silently in the pre-dawn gloom. They could not advance. Parked horizontally across the entrance of the dirt road, blocking both lanes entirely, was the black executive SUV. Rylan Hargrove stood in front of the vehicle's heavy steel grille. His suit jacket was discarded on the passenger seat. His sleeves were rolled up, exposing his forearms to the cold morning air. The lead sheriff stepped out of his cruiser, a heavy flashlight in his hand. He walked up to the billionaire. "Mr. Hargrove," the sheriff said, his tone a mix of deference and confusion. "You're blocking the access road. We have a signed order from your own legal department to clear the parcel." "The order is rescinded," Ryland said. He did not move. "I don't have that in my system, sir. The commissioner told us to execute the demolition. I need you to move the vehicle." Ryland looked at the sheriff. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He did not call his lawyers. He called the governor of the state. He spoke 3 sentences. He held the phone out to the sheriff. The sheriff took the phone, listened briefly, paled, and handed it back. He turned around, signaling to the convoy. The cruisers turned off their light bars. The bulldozers engaged their massive gears and began to reverse down the highway. Rylan watched the convoy disappear. The dust settled back onto the asphalt. He got into the SUV, turned the steering wheel, and drove slowly down the dirt road toward the cracked mud house. He parked beside the skeletal tree. The yard was quiet. The front door of the house opened. Lila Monroe stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing her heavy denim jeans and the faded gray t-shirt. In her hands, she carried a neatly folded stack of fabric. She walked down the wooden steps. She walked across the dry, uneven ground. She approached the black SUV. Ryland stepped out of the vehicle. He looked at her. He waited for the profound moment of connection. He waited for the acknowledgement that he had stopped the machine, that he had saved her home, that he had used his absolute power to protect the memory of his father. Lila did not look at his face. She stopped in front of the hood of the SUV. She placed the folded stack of fabric onto the warm metal of the hood. It was the classic light blue Maid dress. The white collar was perfectly crisp. The spotless white apron rested on top. Placed squarely in the center of the folded apron was her polished obsidian security access card. Ryland looked at the uniform. "The county will restore the water line," he said, his voice quiet. "The land is clear." Lila reached into this pocket of her jeans. She pulled out the hand-carved oak sparrow, the one Ryland had thrown in the wastebasket, the one with the asymmetrical gouge beneath the left wing. She set it gently on top of the folded white apron, right next to the obsidian access card. "The sun is up, Mr. Hargrove," Lila said. Her expression remained gentle, humble, and entirely distant. "You are blocking the path to the well." She turned away from him. She walked to the side of the house, picked up the 2 heavy galvanized steel buckets, and began the long walk toward the creek line. She did not look back. Her stride was steady, uninterrupted, and completely free. Ryland Hargrove stood alone in the dust. He looked at the cracked mud walls. He looked at the empty white wooden chair. He looked down at the hand-carved oak sparrow resting on the pristine fabric of the uniform he owned. The penthouse was silent. The city below moved in its frantic, endless grid, entirely dependent on the logistics empire that spanned the globe. Ryland sat in his hand-stitched leather chair. His posture was rigid. The desk in front of him was clear of all paperwork, all contracts, all evidence of his billions. Resting in the center of the sleek, cold obsidian desk was the crude, unfinished oak sparrow. Ryland placed his flawless, manicured hands on the edge of the desk. He stared at the wooden bird. He did not touch it. He sat in the center of his glass tower, surrounded by everything he had ever built, possessing nothing he could ever keep. The climate control system in the Hargrove Logistics Executive Boardroom was designed to maintain a constant temperature, regardless of the solar heat beating against the exterior glass. The air was filtered, odorless, and sterile. Around the massive custom-milled granite table sat members of the board of directors. They wore dark worsted wool and heavy silk. They did not speak. They looked at the empty chair at the head of the table. Landon Thorpe stood near the projected display on the far wall. The screen showed a map of the United States, dominated by a glaring red indicator over Oak Haven County. The indicator represented a daily capital bleed. The heavy machinery contracts were frozen. The supply chain reroutes were accumulating compounding penalties. The automated hub, the crown jewel of the fiscal year, was a dead zone. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom opened. Ryland Hargrove walked in. He did not carry a tablet. He did not carry a legal pad. He walked to the head of the granite table and sat down. The tailored lines of his navy suit seemed slightly off, as if the fabric were hanging on a frame that had lost its structural density overnight. His collar was perfectly white, but the knot of his tie was loosened by a fraction of an inch, a microscopic deviation that in this room registered as a seismic event. He placed his hands flat on the cold stone of the table. He did not look at the projected map. He looked at the empty space between his fingers. "The Oak Haven site is terminated," Ryland said. His voice lacked the hard, resonant acoustic strike that usually commanded the room. It was flat. "Initiate the contingency survey for the secondary coordinates in the Northern Valley." A murmur rippled through the board members. Landon Thorpe did not move from the screen. He pulled a thick-bound dossier from the podium. "Rylan," Landon said, his tone devoid of the deference he had carried for years. "The Northern Valley coordinates require blasting through solid limestone. The geological survey estimates a significant delay. The Oak Haven site is flat dirt. We have the municipal clearances. We have the eminent domain structure in place. The only obstacle is a single unreinforced clay structure that you unilaterally ordered the county sheriff to ignore." "The site is terminated," Rylan repeated. An older board member at the far end of the table leaned forward. "You wired a large sum of personal capital into a blind trust registered to Silas Monroe recently. You then halted a legal demolition that this board authorized. Our shareholders are watching the primary logistics artery of this company stall because you are protecting a shack in the dust. You have a fiduciary duty to this table, Rylan." Rylan looked up. He looked at the faces of the men and women who only existed in his orbit because he generated wealth. He felt the heavy, crude shape of the hand-carved oak sparrow resting deep in his right pocket. He felt the deep gouge beneath the wing pressing against the fine wool of his trousers. "My duty," Ryland said, standing up slowly, "is to ensure this company does not build its foundation over a grave." He turned and walked out of the boardroom. He left the doors open behind him. The board members sat in the cold, filtered air, looking at Landon Thorpe. Landon placed the bound dossier flat on the podium. He did not look at the door. He looked at the red indicator on the screen. The machine had identified a point of failure. The sun beat down on the cracked earth of Oak Haven County with a heavy physical weight. The air smelled of dry sage and heated dust. Lila Monroe knelt in the dirt beside the eastern wall of the modest house. She wore faded denim jeans and a thick, long-sleeved canvas shirt to protect her skin from the sun. Beside her sat a wide, shallow wooden trough filled with raw clay, sand, and water. She plunged her bare hands into the mixture. The thick, cool mud coated her skin, filling the spaces beneath her fingernails. She worked the materials together, folding the heavy clay over the coarse sand, finding the exact consistency her grandfather had taught her when she was a child. She stood up, carrying a heavy mound of the wet earth. She pressed it firmly into a deep, jagged crack in the dry wall of the house. She used the heel of her hand to smooth the edges, blending the fresh, dark mud into the sun-bleached clay of the existing structure. The physical labor was absolute. It required total concentration. There was no space in her mind for the glass tower. There was no space for the large trust fund sitting untouched in a county bank. There was only the weight of the earth, the heat of the sun, and the structural integrity of the wall. Silas Monroe sat in the simple white wooden chair under the skeletal tree. The tree offered sparse shade, casting thin, sharp lines across his face. He held a block of raw cedar and a curved carving knife. He watched his granddaughter work the mud. "The water pressure is stronger today," Silas said, his voice dry. Lila did not turn around. She scraped excess clay from the wall with the edge of a wooden trowel. "The county flushed the main valve." "They don't flush the main valve unless someone with a heavy footprint steps on their necks," Silas said. He carved a long, smooth strip of cedar from the block. The wood curled and fell to the dust. "The Billionaire stopped the machines. He gave you the water." Lila dipped her hands into the trough, washing the heavy mud from her palms. The water turned a thick, opaque brown. "He did not give us the water, Grandpa," Lila said, her voice steady, carrying the rhythm of her labor. "He stopped stealing it." She picked up the trowel and moved to the next fracture in the wall. The white luxury sedan did not exist. The tailored suits did not exist. The only reality was the mud hardening in the sun, binding the stones together, securing the foundation of her inheritance. Ryland sat in his penthouse office. The lights were off. The only illumination came from the vast electric grid of the city, sprawling beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass. His phone rang. The screen displayed the private number of his lead investment banker. Ryland watched it ring. He did not reach for it. The phone went silent. Seconds later, the private line on his desk began to flash. Then his encrypted email terminal chimed. The isolation he had meticulously constructed through wealth was turning into a quarantine. He opened the center drawer of his desk. The hand-carved oak sparrow sat in the exact middle of the velvet-lined space. Ryland reached in and picked it up. He traced the asymmetrical gouge. He remembered the exact look on his father's face in the photograph pinned to the wall of the dusty back room. It was a face unburdened by the crushing pressure of exponential growth. It was a face that had found value in the slow, meticulous removal of wood to reveal the shape beneath. Ryland squeezed the wooden bird until the sharp edges bit into his palm. He had spent his entire adult life building a fortress of capital to ensure he would never end up like his father. He had succeeded so completely that he had engineered his own total alienation. He had built a world where he could dictate the landscape of entire cities, but he could not make a single woman in a faded gray t-shirt look at him with anything other than polite, absolute indifference. The glass door of his office clicked open. Landon Thorpe stood in the doorway. He did not step inside. He held a single sheet of heavy watermarked paper. "The board convened an emergency session, Ryland," Landon said. The silence of the office swallowed his words, making them sound distant and hollow. The vote was unanimous. Ryland did not turn his chair around. He kept his eyes on the city grid. "Fiduciary negligence and breach of the stability clause," Landon confirmed. "The rerouting of the Oak Haven hub and the large blind trust established a pattern of erratic non-corporate behavior. The shareholders are exposed. The bylaws require immediate separation of the chief executive officer to stabilize the stock price." Landon stepped forward and placed the heavy paper on the edge of the obsidian desk. "Security has disabled your elevator access to the executive floors," Landon said. "You have time to clear your personal effects." Ryland looked at the document. It was a masterpiece of legal severing. It was the exact same mechanism he had used to cut his father out of his life years ago. It was clean, efficient, and entirely devoid of blood. He did not argue. He did not threaten to dismantle the board. He simply opened his hand, looking at the rough oak sparrow resting against his skin. The machine had finally identified him as the inefficiency. The Oak Haven County Courthouse was a squat brick building that smelled of old floor wax and decaying paper. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, inconsistent frequency. Lila Monroe stood at the wooden counter of the property registrar's office. She wore a clean, pressed white blouse and dark trousers. Her hair was tied back in its flawless neat bun. She held a thick, yellowed envelope in her hands. The county clerk, Rebecca Lang, pushed her thick glasses up the bridge of her nose and looked at the documents spread across the counter. She cross-referenced the names against a glowing, outdated computer terminal. "Miss Monroe," Rebecca said, tapping a blunt fingernail against the paper. "There is a massive trust fund attached to this parcel right now. The escrow account holds more capital than the entire municipal budget of this county. If you execute this specific historical preservation deed, you are permanently severing the land from that trust. You forfeit the large sum. It reverts back to the originator." Lila looked at the deed. It was printed on standard municipal paper. It outlined the structural history of the clay house, the age of the foundation, and the continuous lineage of the Monroe family occupation. Once signed and filed, the land could never be zoned for commercial infrastructure. It could never be bought by a logistics empire. It would belong to the dirt, and to her forever. "Where do I sign, Mrs. Lang?" Lila asked. Rebecca slid a black pen across the counter. "Right at the bottom by the red seal." Lila picked up the pen. Her hand was steady. She did not hesitate. She pressed the ink into the paper, writing her name with clear, deliberate strokes. She did not feel the loss of the large sum. She felt the heavy, quiet weight of the cracked mud walls anchoring her to the earth. She felt the cool shade of the skeletal tree. She pushed the paper back across the counter. Rebecca stamped the document with a heavy iron seal. The loud metallic clack echoed in the empty hallway of the courthouse. "It's filed," Rebecca said, sliding a copy into the yellowed envelope and handing it back. "The land is yours. Nobody can run a bulldozer over it now." Lila took the envelope. "Thank you." She walked out of the courthouse and stepped into the bright, unyielding daylight. The heat wrapped around her shoulders. She began the long walk back to the property. Her stride was even, rhythmic, and unbroken. Rylan Hargrove stood in the underground parking garage of the glass tower. The white luxury sedan was parked in his reserved space, its paint gleaming under the harsh artificial lights. The suspension completely repaired. He was wearing his navy blue tailored suit, but he carried no briefcase. He carried no phone. He carried no legal portfolios. Two silent security guards in dark suits stood a distance away, watching him with blank expressions. They were the same men who had enforced his will for years. Now, they were enforcing the boundary between him and the empire he had built. Rylan opened the door of the sedan. He sat in the driver's seat. He closed the heavy door, sealing himself inside the soundproof cabin. He pressed the ignition. The engine hummed. He drove out of the garage, merging into the heavy, chaotic traffic of the city grid. He drove without a destination. The GPS screen on the dashboard remained blank. The buildings towered over him, walls of glass and steel reflecting the afternoon sun, casting deep, sharp shadows across the asphalt. He drove for some time. The city eventually gave way to the suburbs, and the suburbs bled into the highway. He did not turn toward Oak Haven County. The geography of that space was permanently closed to him. He had tried to buy his way into its history, and the transaction had been denied. He pulled the vehicle into an empty paved overlook on the edge of the state line. The sun was beginning to set, burning the horizon into a deep, bruised orange. Rylan turned off the engine. The silence in the cabin was total. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the hand-carved oak sparrow. He set it on the polished dashboard, right above the steering wheel. The rough, unvarnished wood sat in stark contrast to the engineered perfection of the vehicle's interior. He looked at the deep gouge beneath the wing. He finally understood the flaw. It was not a mistake made by a careless hand. It was the natural resistance of the wood. His father had hit a hard knot in the oak, and instead of forcing the blade and breaking the carving, he had allowed the flaw to remain. He had worked around the imperfection. Rylan leaned his head back against the headrest. He looked out through the windshield at the dying light. He possessed billions in offshore accounts. He possessed the clothes on his back. He possessed the luxury vehicle. But sitting in the absolute quiet, he realized he was the most hollow structure in the landscape. He had spent his life polishing the glass, and now there was nothing behind it. The evening air over the Monroe property cooled quickly as the sun dipped behind the dry hills. The sky transitioned from vibrant orange to a deep dark blue. The stars began to pierce the rural darkness, sharp and clear, without the interference of city lights. Lila Monroe, sat on the front porch of the rustic house. The old wooden floorboards creaked softly as she shifted her weight. She was wearing her faded gray t-shirt and heavy denim jeans. Her raw, blistered hands rested quietly in her lap, the skin slowly healing. The eastern wall of the house was smooth and solid, the fresh clay drying perfectly into the old fractures. The tap in the kitchen held steady pressure. The heavy galvanized steel bucket sat empty by the back door. The white wooden chair under the skeletal tree was vacant. Silas had gone to sleep. The quiet, steady rhythm of his breathing echoed faintly through the open screen door. Lila reached into her pocket. She pulled out the mate to the oak sparrow, the one with the perfect wings, the one her grandfather had carved. She held it in her palm, feeling the smooth, finished grain of the wood. She did not think of the glass tower. She did not think of the polished obsidian desk or the large sum she had permanently erased with a single signature. She did not think of the man in the tailored suit who had tried to consume her world. He was simply a storm that had passed over the hills, kicking up dust before moving on. She looked out at the empty dirt road. The barricades were gone. The heavy machinery was gone. The silence of the countryside was deep, natural, and entirely unbroken. Lila pressed the wooden sparrow gently between her hands, closed her eyes, and listened to the wind move through the dry grass. She was completely, fundamentally free. True wealth is not measured by the size of a company, the shine of a luxury car, or the number written in a bank account. This story reminds us that the most valuable things in life are often the things money cannot buy. Dignity, family, memory, forgiveness, and the quiet peace of knowing who we are. Rylan had everything the world calls success, but he had lost the ability to see people. Lila had almost nothing in the eyes of society, yet she carried something far greater: loyalty, strength, and a heart anchored in love. Her humble home was not just clay walls and cracked earth. It was history. It was sacrifice. It was the last place where a broken man had found warmth before leaving this world. The lesson is powerful. Never look down on someone because of their job, their house, or their silence. Sometimes the person serving you may carry a story deeper than your pride can understand. And sometimes, when we try to destroy what seems small, we destroy the only thing that could have saved our own soul. In real life, kindness should never wait until regret teaches us humility. Look at people with compassion before life forces you to see their pain. Respect what others hold sacred, even if you do not understand it yet. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Lila's place? And if you believe stories like this still matter, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell for more emotional stories about justice, humanity, and the lessons that change us forever.